On a late afternoon at a small supermarket in Austin, Texas, David Carter, a 50-year-old black veteran, walked in to do some shopping. He had a calm demeanor and the authoritative presence of someone who had served in the military. While selecting items, David happened to witness Officer Sarah Mitchell, a young white female police officer, accidentally drop a pack of noodles and a bottle of soda on the floor but make no effort to pick them up. Gently reminding her about maintaining order in public places, David did not expect his words to spark a tense situation. Sarah immediately displayed irritation, responding with a mocking tone and making remarks about his age and race. Unfazed by her provocation, David calmly replied, emphasizing that police officers should set an example for the community. However, Sarah became even more aggressive, resting her hand on her gun and ordering David to step back. Her actions left the surrounding shoppers stunned. Some began recording videos, while David remained composed and took out his phone to call the police department, reporting Sarah's abuse of power. Realizing she was in trouble, Sarah started to look nervous. Within moments, a team of officers arrived along with Mayor Andrew Preston. Upon recognizing David as a decorated veteran, Mayor Preston reviewed the video footage and immediately ordered Sarah's suspension. Within hours, the incident spread rapidly across the media, leading to a wave of accusations against Sarah for prior misconduct. Not only did she lose her job, but she also faced legal consequences. Meanwhile, David's story became a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination and police abuse of power. Following the incident, David Carter found himself thrust into the public eye in a way he had never expected. His actions that night, calmly asserting his rights, refusing to back down, and capturing the entire encounter on video, became a symbol of resilience in the face of systemic injustice. The footage quickly spread across social media, drawing national attention and sparking debates about racial profiling and police misconduct. Journalists from major news outlets reached out, eager to hear his perspective, and civil rights organizations invited him to speak at rallies and community forums. Though David had never sought fame or recognition, he understood the power of his story. He chose to step forward, not for himself, but for those who had faced similar injustices without a platform to speak. Meanwhile, the internal investigation into Officer Sarah Mitchell's past conduct uncovered troubling patterns. Records showed that over the years, she had been the subject of multiple civilian complaints, many of which had been quietly dismissed without a thorough review. Reports alleged that she had used excessive force in previous encounters and had a history of disproportionately targeting black men during routine stops. As public pressure mounted, the police department could no longer ignore the evidence. The Internal Affairs Division reopened old cases, and after weeks of scrutiny, the department announced formal charges against Mitchell for misconduct. She was placed on administrative leave pending legal proceedings, a move that many in the community saw as long overdue. In response to the growing public outcry, Mayor Andrew Preston held a press conference addressing the concerns of the community. He acknowledged the deep-rooted issues within the city's police force and pledged immediate reforms to restore trust. Under his new policies, body cameras would become mandatory for all officers on duty, ensuring that future encounters would be recorded and subject to independent review. Additionally, a civilian oversight committee, composed of community leaders, legal experts, and former law enforcement officials, was established to review misconduct complaints and hold officers accountable. The mayor's office also promised mandatory bias training for all police personnel, hoping to prevent further incidents like the one involving David. Despite the sudden media attention, David remained grounded. He had never seen himself as an activist, but the experience changed him. Determined to make a difference beyond just his own case, he began working closely with local organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform. He attended town hall meetings, spoke with young people about their rights, and encouraged others to stand up against injustice. Though he had not sought this role, he embraced it, believing that change could only come when ordinary people stood together and demanded it. His courage not only helped hold one officer accountable, but also ignited a broader movement for lasting reform in the city. As the legal proceedings against Officer Sarah Mitchell moved forward, the city remained on edge. Community protests grew larger, with activists demanding not just her conviction, but also deeper structural changes within the police force. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee began reviewing past cases, and what they uncovered was deeply troubling. Dozens of complaints from marginalized communities that had been dismissed without proper investigation. The revelations only fueled public anger, leading to nightly demonstrations outside City Hall and police headquarters. David Carter, now a central figure in the movement, continued to speak out. He was invited to panel discussions, interviews, and town hall meetings where he shared his experience and advocated for lasting change. Though the attention was overwhelming at times, he knew the importance of his role. With every speech he gave, he emphasized that his case was not unique. It was part of a long history of injustice that needed to be addressed at its core. He worked alongside legal experts, activists, and city officials to push for concrete policy changes, including stronger accountability measures for officers and better training programs to reduce racial bias in law enforcement. Meanwhile, Officer Mitchell's defense team tried to shift the narrative. They argued that she had merely been doing her job and that her actions were being unfairly scrutinized due to public pressure. However, with the overwhelming evidence against her, including body camera footage and witness testimonies, their arguments struggled to hold weight. As the trial date approached, tensions in the city continued to rise. Some feared that if justice was not served, the unrest could escalate further. In the midst of it all, David faced personal struggles. His sudden rise to prominence came with both support and backlash. While many people admired his courage, others, including law enforcement supporters, labeled him as a troublemaker or an agitator. He received threats online, and at times he worried for his safety. But he refused to be silenced. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts, believing that real change required persistence and sacrifice. The night before the trial began, David stood before a packed community center, addressing a crowd of supporters. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady and determined. "This is about every person who has been stopped, harassed, or mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. We're here to demand justice, not just for one case, but for an entire system that needs to change." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices united in a single cause. As the trial commenced, the city held its breath, waiting to see whether justice would finally be served. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists, activists, and concerned citizens filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. David Carter sat in the front row, his posture straight, his hands clenched together. He had spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could fully brace him for the emotional weight of seeing Officer Sarah Mitchell seated at the defendant's table, dressed in a crisp suit instead of her police uniform. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They played the body camera footage, which showed Mitchell drawing her weapon within seconds of approaching David and shouting conflicting commands before firing. The room was silent as the video ended, the image of David collapsing onto the pavement frozen on the screen. Then came the testimonies, eyewitnesses, medical experts, and community members who had experienced similar encounters with the police. Each account painted a damning picture of an officer who had acted recklessly, allowing her implicit biases to cloud her judgment. When David took the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. He recounted the events of that day with measured precision, his voice unwavering despite the pain in his eyes. He spoke about the fear he had felt in that moment, the disbelief as he lay on the ground bleeding, wondering if he would live to see another day. The defense attempted to rattle him, questioning his past, suggesting that his reaction to the officer had been suspicious. But David refused to be shaken. "I was just a man walking home," he said firmly, looking directly at the jury. "And she saw me as a threat before I even said a word." The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. They brought in character witnesses who spoke of Mitchell's years of service, her commendations, and her supposed commitment to the community. They tried to argue that the situation had been chaotic, that she had made a split-second decision under pressure. But each time, the prosecution dismantled their arguments, pointing to her inconsistent statements and the clear evidence that David had posed no threat. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued. Supporters held signs demanding justice, their voices echoing through the streets. Others, including pro-law enforcement groups, rallied in Mitchell's defense, arguing that she was being scapegoated. The city's divisions were laid bare, the trial serving as a reflection of the broader national debate over policing, race, and accountability. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides prepared for closing arguments. David knew that whatever the verdict, this fight was bigger than one case. The struggle for justice, for real change, would not end here. But as he sat in that courtroom, he couldn't help but wonder, would the system finally hold one of its own accountable? As the final day of the trial arrived, the tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating. The judge called for order as the prosecution and defense prepared to deliver their closing arguments. David Carter sat rigid in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent weeks reliving the moment he was shot, enduring cross-examinations that sought to cast doubt on his innocence, listening as Officer Mitchell's defense team tried to paint her as the true victim. Now, everything came down to this. The prosecutor, a sharp and methodical woman named Rebecca Lawson, stepped forward with quiet confidence. She paused for a moment, letting her gaze sweep over the jurors before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but firm, "what we have seen throughout this trial is not just a tragic mistake. It is a pattern, one that has played out time and time again in this country." Officer Mitchell saw David Carter, an unarmed black man, and before she asked a single question, before she assessed the situation, she pulled her weapon. She made a choice based on fear, based on bias, and nearly ended this man's life. We are here today because we must ask ourselves, do we accept this as the norm, or do we demand accountability? She walked slowly across the courtroom, her words resonating with the weight of history. She reminded the jury of the body camera footage, the conflicting commands Mitchell had shouted, the expert testimony that proved David had not posed any threat. She spoke of the systemic issues at play, but made it clear that, in this case, the responsibility lay squarely on the shoulders of the officer who fired the shot. Then, it was the defense's turn. Mitchell's lawyer, a seasoned litigator named Thomas Reed, adjusted his tie and approached the jury with a measured expression. "Fear," he said simply, letting the word hang in the air. "It is easy to judge Officer Mitchell from the safety of this courtroom. It is easy to watch that footage, to hear testimony, and believe that she acted recklessly. But have any of us ever stood in her shoes? Have we ever faced a moment where a single decision could mean life or death?" He paced in front of the jury, his tone calm, almost pleading. He spoke of the pressures officers faced, the unpredictability of the job. He reminded them of Mitchell's record, her years of service, the commendation she had received, the testimonies of fellow officers who described her as dedicated and fair. He argued that she had reacted to a rapidly unfolding situation and that, while tragic, her actions had not been criminal. As he concluded, Mitchell sat rigid at the defense table, her face unreadable. The judge instructed the jury on their responsibilities before dismissing them for deliberation. The courtroom remained silent as they filed out, leaving behind a room full of restless anticipation. Outside, the city braced itself. Protesters gathered in the streets, some calling for justice, others demanding support for law enforcement. News cameras captured the scene, analysts debated the possible verdict, and social media erupted with speculation. Inside the courthouse, David sat with his hands clasped together, his mother at his side. No matter the outcome, he knew his life had been changed forever. But one question remained. Would the system, for once, deliver justice? Hours passed as the jury deliberated, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. David Carter sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, his hands clasped together tightly. His mother, Evelyn, sat beside him, occasionally squeezing his hand for reassurance. Across the room, Officer Mitchell sat with her attorney, her expression unreadable, but the way she held her shoulders rigidly revealed the stress she was under. The news had already spread throughout the city. Crowds had gathered outside, their chants and calls for justice occasionally filtering through the courthouse walls. Police officers in riot gear lined the streets, prepared for any possible unrest, their presence only fueling the unease that had settled over the community. Then the announcement came. The jury had reached a verdict. David felt his breath catch in his throat. He stood, legs slightly unsteady, as the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. Reporters rushed to their seats, murmurs rippling through the crowd before the judge banged his gavel for silence. "All rise." The jury filed in, their faces solemn, their expressions giving nothing away. The judge turned to the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with glasses who held a single sheet of paper in her trembling hands. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. David could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat. He could feel his mother gripping his arm. Across the aisle, Officer Mitchell sat motionless, her lawyer whispering something to her, though she barely seemed to register it. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson took a breath. In the case of the state versus Officer Rebecca Mitchell, on the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. A hush fell over the courtroom, then a sharp gasp, followed by murmurs. David let out a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding. His mother squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes welling with tears. The guilty verdict meant accountability. Finally, accountability. But it wasn't over yet. The foreperson continued reading. On the charge of first-degree assault, we find the defendant not guilty. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Some sighed in disappointment, others nodded solemnly. Mitchell's attorney let out a breath of relief, while the officer herself remained stone-faced, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. David felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, frustration, exhaustion. The jury had convicted her, but only on a lesser charge. She would face consequences, but would they be enough? Would this verdict change anything for the next black man put in the same position? The judge called for order as the noise in the courtroom swelled. He addressed the jury, thanking them for their service, then turned to the prosecution and defense. The court will reconvene next week for sentencing, he announced, his tone firm. Until then, Officer Mitchell is remanded to house arrest with electronic monitoring. Mitchell closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose before she was led out by deputies. David sat still, trying to process everything. He had fought for justice, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had never received it. This verdict was something, but was it truly enough? As he stepped outside the courthouse, greeted by a wave of reporters and flashing cameras, he realized the fight wasn't over. The system had taken a step, but change would require more than just one conviction. It would take a movement. And he was ready. As David walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy cloak. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street as the sound of distant traffic and city life filled the air. He had expected this day to feel different, more victorious, more definitive, but instead, it left him with an emptiness that was hard to shake. The conviction was a victory, but it was not the kind he had imagined. His mother, Evelyn, kept pace beside him, her voice soft but steady. "We did what we set out to do, David. We got her on something. And that matters." David nodded, though his mind remained clouded. He could feel the eyes of the public on him. People on the streets had seen the cameras, heard the verdict. He could hear snippets of conversation, some congratulatory, others skeptical. For a moment, it felt like the whole world was watching him, waiting for his reaction. He could feel the weight of those expectations pressing down on him. Turning to his mother, David squeezed her hand. "I know. It's just not enough, Mom. She got convicted, but not on the charge that would have put her behind bars for years. It's not what I wanted. Not for myself, not for the people we fought for." Evelyn gave him a sympathetic look, her eyes filled with understanding. "You know, sometimes the system is slow. Sometimes it doesn't give us everything we want in the way we expect. But you've done something incredible here. You've shown that it's possible for the system to listen, even if it's just one small step. You've raised the bar." David stopped walking, his gaze shifting toward the horizon, where the city skyline met the fading orange sky. He wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. Was this really a step forward, or was it just another Band-Aid on a wound that had yet to heal? A voice interrupted his thoughts. David Carter." Turning, he saw a reporter rush toward him, her camera crew in tow. Her face was familiar. She had been at the courthouse all day, catching every angle, recording every moment. "How are you feeling about the verdict?" the reporter asked, her microphone pointing toward him. "Do you feel that justice has truly been served?" David paused, his mind racing for the right words. The cameras were on him, the world watching once again. But this time, it wasn't just about the case. It was about everything that had led him here, all the people who had fought beside him, and all the voices that hadn't been heard. He straightened up, his voice clear and measured. "I think today is a reminder of the work we still have left to do. This verdict is a victory, yes, but it's just one step. We've shown that accountability is possible, but we need to keep pushing. We need to make sure that the system holds people responsible for their actions, not just when it's convenient or when it looks good on paper." The reporter nodded, scribbling in her notebook. "So you're not satisfied with the verdict?" David shook his head slightly. "I'm satisfied with what we've achieved, but I'm not done. This is just the beginning. We've raised awareness, and we've made it clear that things need to change. But I'll keep fighting until we get the justice we deserve, not just for me, but for everyone who's been let down by this system." As he finished speaking, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about change, and he was determined to keep pushing, even when the path seemed uncertain. Evelyn stood beside him, proud but quiet, knowing that her son's journey wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever felt unheard, unseen, or abandoned. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, David knew that his fight was far from finished. The world would change, one step at a time, and he would be there to help lead the way. The next morning, David found himself standing at the entrance of the courthouse again, though this time it felt different. The usual sense of familiarity was gone. Today was not about a victory in the courtroom. It was about what came next. What would happen now that the case had been concluded? What would be the long-term impact of all their hard work, their sleepless nights, their relentless pursuit of justice? He looked up at the courthouse, the stone walls still imposing, as if they held secrets that no one could ever fully uncover. Despite the outcome of the trial, there were still so many pieces left unsolved. His thoughts drifted to the families that had supported him, the victims who were still waiting for answers, the ones whose voices hadn't been heard in the frenzy of legal battles. David, a voice called out from behind him. It was Rachel, the young police officer who had been with him every step of the way, keeping him grounded when things felt overwhelming. She was walking toward him, a slight frown on her face, as though she too was processing the weight of everything that had happened. "Hey," he greeted her, offering a small smile despite the heaviness in his chest. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. "I know yesterday was a lot." David nodded, taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm just trying to make sense of it all. The verdict wasn't what I hoped for, but at the same time, we did what we came here to do. We exposed the truth, and we got some accountability. But there's still so much more to fix." Rachel stood beside him, her eyes scanning the courthouse steps, as though searching for something she couldn't quite find. "I get it," she said after a long pause. "It's not always going to be perfect. But we can't let that stop us from pushing for what's right. Even if it's just one case, one conviction, it's still progress. And that matters." David turned to face her, his gaze steady. "I know. It's hard to feel like this is enough when so many people are still hurting. I spent so long thinking that if I just did enough, if I worked hard enough, things would change. But change doesn't happen all at once. It's slow. And sometimes it feels like we're never going to catch up with the damage that's already been done." Rachel met his eyes with a quiet intensity, as though she understood exactly what he was feeling. "The change you're talking about doesn't happen in a single day, David. But it starts with people like you. People who care enough to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against them. You've shown us that change is possible." David looked out at the courthouse once more, the weight of Rachel's words sinking in. It was easy to become disillusioned when the road ahead seemed endless, but he knew she was right. The change he wanted, the change they all wanted, would take time. But it would start with them, with the work they were doing right now. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice quieter now, more resolved. "Maybe I need to stop looking at this as the end and start seeing it as the beginning. We've made a difference, and that's something." Rachel smiled, a small but genuine smile that made the heaviness in David's chest feel just a little lighter. "Exactly. You're already changing things, one step at a time." As they stood together, staring at the courthouse, David finally allowed himself a moment of hope. The journey ahead was uncertain, the battle's far from over, but he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. And that knowledge, for the first time in a long while, brought him peace. The road was long, but he would keep walking it, step by step, until justice was no longer a distant hope, but a reality. As David and Rachel stood in the shadow of the courthouse, the buzz of the city around them seemed almost distant. People walked past, absorbed in their own lives, unaware of the quiet moment of reflection happening between the two of them. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the building's stone facade, and yet the weight of the past few days was still heavy on David's shoulders. "Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" David asked suddenly, his voice softer now, as though he were thinking out loud. Rachel turned to face him, her eyes thoughtful, and for a moment there was a silence between them, filled with unspoken understanding. She knew what he meant. It wasn't just about the case. It was about everything. The years of dedication, the sacrifices, the constant grind of trying to make things better, only to be met with setbacks and challenges that seemed never-ending. The journey was exhausting, and sometimes it was hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But Rachel didn't hesitate. She shook her head slowly. I think if you stop asking yourself that question, then it's not worth it anymore. If you stop wondering whether it's worth the fight, you risk losing everything you stand for. David nodded, her words resonating deeply with him. He had been on the edge of burnout for months, unsure if the constant push for justice, the long hours, the emotional toll, was ever going to amount to something greater. But Rachel was right. It wasn't about any one case. It wasn't about the result of yesterday's trial. It was about the bigger picture, the cumulative impact of every action, every moment of advocacy, every voice raised in defense of what was right. I guess you're right, he said, offering a faint smile. I just wish it didn't feel like the work never ends. Rachel smiled back, a knowing look in her eyes. It won't end. Not for us, anyway. But that's what makes it matter. We're always moving forward, always learning, always growing. And there are people out there, people we'll never meet, who benefit from the things we do. David took a deep breath, the weight in his chest easing just slightly. He had been so focused on the immediate challenges, on the obstacles ahead, that he had forgotten to look at the broader impact. The work wasn't just about the results he could see right now. It was about creating a legacy, a ripple effect that would continue long after the case files were closed. Maybe it's about the little things, he murmured, more to himself than to Rachel. The ones that add up over time. That's exactly it, Rachel said, her voice warm with encouragement. One step at a time, David. One case, one conversation, one decision, all of it matters. As they turned to leave, the weight of the past few days still with him, but now balanced by a quiet sense of resolve, David knew she was right. He wasn't alone in this fight. And maybe, just maybe, the small victories were worth celebrating, no matter how long the road ahead seemed. Every effort, no matter how small it appeared, was a part of the change they were all working toward. With a final glance at the courthouse, David straightened up, his steps growing more purposeful as he walked alongside Rachel. The journey would be long. The battles would be tough. But he was ready to face whatever came next, because he knew he wasn't fighting alone. As David and Rachel walked away from the courthouse, their conversation faded into a comfortable silence. The night air was crisp, and the streets were quieter now, the evening rush of people beginning to dissipate. Yet, despite the tranquility around them, David felt a shift within himself. It was subtle, but undeniable. The weight of uncertainty had lightened, replaced by something more solid, purpose. Rachel walked beside him, her pace matching his, neither of them speaking, but the unspoken understanding between them was palpable. They both knew that the work they did, no matter how exhausting or overwhelming, had meaning. They were part of something bigger than themselves, something that couldn't always be measured in victories or defeats. It was the day-to-day, consistency of showing up, of fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. As they turned the corner, the bright lights of a nearby cafe caught David's attention. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the inviting warmth from the windows beckoned him. He glanced at Rachel, who, sensing his unspoken thought, gave him a slight nod. I think we've earned a break, David said with a small smile, the first one in days that felt genuine. Rachel didn't hesitate. A coffee sounds perfect right about now. They entered the cafe, greeted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of casual conversation. The place was cozy, with mismatched chairs and tables that gave it a relaxed, almost homey vibe. As they made their way to an empty table by the window, David allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. The world outside seemed so far away, the chaos and demands of their jobs momentarily forgotten. For the first time in a while, David let himself relax into the moment. He watched as Rachel ordered their drinks at the counter, her calm demeanor offering him a sense of peace he hadn't realized he needed. When she returned with their cups, they both took a seat and sipped their coffee in comfortable silence. David let out a long sigh, finally able to unwind. You know, he began, his voice low, I always thought I'd have all the answers by now, that I'd be able to solve every case, every problem. But it's like the more I do, the more I realize there's so much I don't know. Rachel gave him a thoughtful look, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the cafe. That's the thing about this work, David. It's never really about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, being open to learning, and staying committed to doing your best. It's about progress, not perfection. David nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Yeah, I guess I've been chasing the idea of perfection for too long. But maybe I should focus more on the progress, the little things we can change. That's the key, Rachel said, smiling. And sometimes the little things add up to something big. You might not see it right away, but every positive impact, every person you help, adds to the bigger picture. For the first time in days, David felt a sense of relief wash over him. He realized that he didn't have to have everything figured out right now. The work would continue, and he would keep showing up, doing what he could, one step at a time. With Rachel by his side, and the lessons they had shared, he felt ready to face whatever the future held. The cafe, the warmth of the coffee, the quiet evening. They were small moments, but for David, they represented a pause in the storm. A chance to regroup, reflect, and remember why he fought in the first place. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was walking it with purpose and not alone.